14 men would die because a tractor never made it back. Not a weapon, not money, not drugs. A single piece of farm equipment that disappeared and was never returned. By the time anyone outside the neighborhood understood what had started it, the damage was already irreversible. This was Chicago, 1985. Far from downtown and far from the version of the city people recognized. On the industrial edges where scrap yards, storage lots, and informal work arrangements overlapped, problems were handled quietly and agreements mattered more than paperwork. When the tractor went missing, the assumption was simple. It would be resolved the same way everything else was resolved. A conversation, a favor, a correction made without involving outsiders. That assumption was the first mistake. The tractor belonged to a small group of men who shared work, equipment, and trust. Its disappearance wasn't treated as theft at first, but as a delay, a misunderstanding that would sort itself out. Days passed, then more days. Explanations shifted. The machine didn't return, and neither did a clear answer. What should have been a minor problem started to feel like a test of respect. And in places like this, unresolved disrespect never stayed small for long. By the time people realized the situation was no longer cooling off, it had already hardened into something dangerous. What made this worse was how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. People showed up to work. Trucks came and went. No police reports were filed. Nothing about the missing tractor forced urgency. And that lack of urgency allowed suspicion to spread quietly. Men began to notice who avoided certain conversations and who stopped answering calls. Stories didn't line up. Each attempt to explain what had happened only introduced new contradictions. This is where it stopped being about recovering equipment and started being about restoring balance. The first attempt to settle it quietly failed. Then another. Compensation was discussed. Blame was deflected. No version of events satisfied everyone, and every delay made the situation harder to contain. By the time anyone considered bringing in law enforcement, the rules had already changed. Involving outsiders would expose side work, debts, and arrangements no one could afford to explain. Silence became the default response, and silence allowed the pressure to build unchecked. The first man disappeared before anyone admitted how serious the situation had become. He wasn't reported missing. There was no search. His absence was noticed, then quietly accepted. That disappearance changed everything. It made clear that the problem was no longer theoretical, and that proximity alone could be enough to put someone at risk. From that moment on, survival depended on choosing the right side of a conflict no one was willing to define openly. And once that line was crossed, there was no way to step back without becoming vulnerable. In the Haberdine, weeks after the first man disappeared, the circle around the stolen tractor tightened without anyone acknowledging it openly. Conversations became shorter and more deliberate, held in parked cars or along loading docks, where noise swallowed words. The men involved knew each other's habits well enough to notice when something shifted, when a routine broke just slightly out of pattern. One stopped showing up for early morning work. Another changed where he parked his truck. A third began sending messages through intermediaries instead of speaking directly. These were small things, but in a world built on informal agreements, small changes carried weight. The tractor itself was still unaccounted for, and that absence began to take on a meaning larger than the machine. It represented disrespect, a challenge to the balance that kept everyone working without interference. Whoever had taken it or failed to return it had forced the others into a position where doing nothing looked like weakness. Attempts were made to smooth it over. One man offered compensation. Another suggested the tractor had been damaged and quietly scrapped. None of the explanations lined up, and the contradictions only deepened suspicion. When a second man vanished, the tone shifted completely. He had been present for several of the early conversations, someone trusted enough to hear multiple versions of the story. His disappearance sent a clear message. Proximity was no longer protection. Knowing too much was now a liability. After that, meetings stopped being about the tractor at all. They became interrogations in all but name, with men pressed to clarify where they stood, what they had seen, and who they believed. Chicago's size offered cover, but it also created blind spots where people could disappear without drawing attention, especially if no one insisted on looking. The police were never formally brought in, not because the men involved thought they could handle violence better, but because involving outsiders would expose everyone's side work, debts, and arrangements. Silence became the default response, and silence allowed the pressure to build unchecked. The third death didn't look like murder on paper. An accident, a fall, circumstances that closed a file quickly. Those who knew the man understood otherwise. He had been the most vocal about settling the issue, the one pushing for resolution before things went too far. His removal marked a turning point. From then on, the goal was no longer to recover what had been lost, but to remove uncertainty entirely. Anyone who could reopen the argument became a risk. Anyone who might talk became expendable. By the end of that summer, 4 men were gone, and the pattern was clear to those trapped inside it. Each disappearance reduced the number of people who could challenge the narrative, but it also narrowed the circle of trust to a dangerous degree. Men who had worked together for years now watched each other, constantly, calculating who might be next. The tractor, once the center of every conversation, was barely mentioned. It had served its purpose. What remained was a cycle driven by fear and obligation, where every decision to protect oneself increased the threat to everyone else. And as fall approached, the violence didn't slow. It became more efficient, quieter, and harder to distinguish from the normal attrition of a city that rarely noticed when men on its margins stopped coming home. By early autumn, the story had split into 2 realities that barely touched. To the outside world, Chicago kept moving at its usual pace. Factories humming, trucks rolling in and out, men showing up and disappearing from jobs without anyone asking too many questions. Inside the shrinking circle around the tractor, the atmosphere was tightening into something close to panic. Every absence now carried intent. Every delay felt deliberate. Men began sleeping in different places, avoiding predictable routes, making sure someone always knew where they were supposed to be, even if no one was willing to admit why that mattered. The 5th man died in a way that sent the clearest signal yet. He had tried to distance himself completely, stepping away from shared work, refusing calls, insisting he had nothing to do with what happened. It didn't save him. His death made it obvious that withdrawal was being read as guilt, that silence was no longer neutral. After that, loyalty became mandatory, but loyalty to what was never clearly defined. Some believed the tractor had been taken as leverage, others that it had been destroyed early on to cover a mistake. But by then the truth was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that no version of events satisfied everyone, and every unresolved detail created a reason to act. The 6th and 7th men disappeared within weeks of each other, both connected to storage sites where equipment had been kept, both people who could plausibly explain where. The tractor had gone if pressed hard enough. Their removals followed the same pattern. No witnesses, no clear crime scene, no official investigation that stuck. Each loss simplified the situation while making it more volatile, because with fewer people left, suspicion had nowhere to diffuse. By late October, even those who had never touched the tractor understood they were trapped by proximity. They had shared space, shared work, shared knowledge, and that was enough. The killings didn't escalate in spectacle, but in certainty. Decisions were made faster. Excuses were no longer entertained. The 8th death was followed by the 9th within days. And this time, the explanations offered to families were thinner, barely coherent. No one expected them to hold up. They were meant only to delay questions until the moment passed. Inside the circle, the violence had taken on a grim logic. Each death reduced the risk of exposure while increasing the pressure on those who remained. It was understood that the only way out was through, that leaving loose ends would invite outside attention that no one could afford. By November, the count had reached 10, and the tractor had become almost mythical, a symbol invoked to justify actions that had long since exceeded the original offense. Men spoke of it as if it were still in play, still capable of being returned and fixing everything, even as they acted in ways that made any resolution impossible. The city's indifference made it easier. Chicago swallowed disappearances easily, especially when they came from its edges, and the men involved relied on that indifference to keep moving. What they didn't realize was how little margin they had left. With each death, the circle grew smaller, and in a circle this tight, there was no room for error, no space for misunderstanding, and no way to stop once the final phase had begun. By the time winter closed in, the situation had reached a point where no one inside it believed survival was possible without decisive action. The circle had collapsed to a handful of men who all knew the same thing. If the violence paused now, it wouldn't end, it would only draw attention. Every disappearance so far had been absorbed by the city's background noise, explained away by accidents, relocations, or bad luck. But the smaller the group became, the harder it was to hide patterns. The 11th man died after a meeting that was supposed to finalize a solution, a last attempt to agree on a single version of events that could be carried forward and defended if questioned. He arrived believing that compromise was still possible. He left believing it wasn't. His death marked the moment when the goal shifted from control to closure. From then on, the remaining men understood that there would be no survivors who could contradict each other. The tractor itself was no longer mentioned at all. It had stopped being an object and become a justification, a shorthand for everything that had gone wrong and everything that now had to be erased. The 12th and 13th deaths followed quickly, carried out with a level of detachment that shocked even those involved. These were not impulsive acts. They were decisions made after weeks of fear and calculation, executed quietly to avoid mistakes. Each removal simplified the story that would eventually be told, reducing it to fragments that could never be assembled into a full picture. By the time the 14th man was killed, there was no circle left, only isolated individuals trying to outlast the consequences of what they had done. That final death didn't feel like victory or relief. It felt like exhaustion. The violence stopped not because justice had been served, but because there was no one left who could benefit from continuing it. In the months that followed, the city closed ranks around the absence. Files were opened and closed without urgency. Leads went nowhere. Families were given explanations that barely made sense. But they were explanations all the same. And in a city like Chicago, that was often enough to end a conversation. What made the massacre truly forgotten wasn't a cover-up orchestrated from above, but a convergence of disinterest, fear, and exhaustion from below. No one wanted to be the person who pulled at a thread that could unravel everything. The stolen tractor was never recovered. Whether it was destroyed early on or passed through hands until it disappeared into scrap was never established. What remained was a quiet understanding among those who had lived close enough to feel the fallout. That something absurdly small had triggered something uncontrollably large, and that once the balance had tipped, stopping it required erasing everyone who could challenge the version of events left behind. The forgotten massacre of 1985 did not end with answers or accountability. It ended with silence, the kind that settles in not because it is enforced, but because no one sees a way to break it without starting the cycle all over again. After the 14th death, there was no announcement, no moment where anyone acknowledged that it was over. The violence simply stopped, as abruptly as it had accelerated, leaving behind a vacuum that was filled by routine and denial. Jobs were reassigned. Storage spaces were cleared out. Equipment changed hands quietly, stripped of any connection to the people who had once used it. The men who remained alive adjusted their stories to fit what little scrutiny came their way. Each version incomplete, but compatible enough to avoid contradiction. Police reports reflected this fragmentation, listing unrelated incidents, accidents, missing persons with no clear link. Without a single crime scene or a clear sequence, there was nothing to pursue aggressively, and the city's attention drifted elsewhere. Chicago in the mid-1980s had no shortage of violence competing for headlines, and 14 men, disappearing on the industrial margins, failed to register as a unified event. That indifference became the final layer of protection. Over time, the people who had been closest to the events learned how to live around them, carrying a private understanding of what had happened without ever articulating it fully. Some left the city. Others stayed and avoided certain areas, certain names, certain memories. Families grieved without closure, piecing together fragments that never formed a whole, sensing that pushing for answers would only isolate them further. The stolen tractor faded into rumor, its fate debated quietly but never confirmed. And in that uncertainty, it retained its symbolic weight. It was the smallest possible cause for the largest possible consequence, a reminder of how quickly informal systems collapse when trust is breached, and how difficult they are to rebuild once fear takes hold. Years later, when occasional inquiries surfaced, they stalled in the same way, confronted by missing records and unwilling witnesses. The massacre remained forgotten not because it was deliberately erased, but because forgetting was the only outcome that allowed life to continue. What survived instead was a cautionary memory, held by a shrinking number of people, that some conflicts do not resolve through confrontation or justice, but through exhaustion and absence. The events of 1985 left no monument and no official reckoning, only a pattern of silence that ensured the story would never be told in full. And that silence, more than the violence itself, is what allowed 14 deaths over a stolen tractor to disappear into the city's history without ever demanding to be remembered. In the years that followed, the story slipped further into the background, surviving only in fragments that never quite connected. Men who had worked alongside the dead learned how to answer questions without answering them, offering just enough detail to satisfy curiosity without exposing themselves to risk. New people entered the spaces the victims had once occupied, unaware that they were stepping into the aftermath of something unresolved. To them, the gaps felt normal. In a city as large as Chicago, turnover was constant and absence rarely demanded explanation. The massacre remained forgotten because it fit too neatly into that rhythm. There was no single night to commemorate, no photograph that captured the whole of it, no survivor willing to assemble the pieces. Each death had been absorbed individually, disguised as something ordinary, and by the time anyone might have noticed the pattern, it was already complete. The stolen tractor, once the center of every argument, became an afterthought, mentioned only in whispers, its role almost embarrassing in hindsight. That embarrassment helped bury the story. It was easier to accept that men had vanished for complicated reasons than to confront the idea that something so mundane had set everything in motion. Over time, even those who knew the truth learned to doubt the clarity of their own memories, questioning whether it had really been that simple, that fragile. The city moved on, and with each passing year, the chance of reopening the case diminished. Records were misplaced. Witnesses died or relocated. Context dissolved. What remained was a lesson that no one ever stated aloud. That informal systems, once broken, could consume everyone connected to them. And that the scale of the outcome was not determined by the size of the original offense, but by how long it was allowed to fester. The forgotten massacre of 1985 did not become legend or cautionary tale. It became background noise, part of the city's unspoken history, influencing behavior without demanding recognition. And that is why it endures only as absence. 14 men died, not in a single act of violence, but through a sequence of decisions driven by fear, loyalty, and the need to close ranks. The tractor was never recovered, and perhaps that is fitting. Its disappearance was never meant to be resolved. It existed only to reveal how quickly a small theft could expose fault lines that ran far deeper than anyone was prepared to face, and how, once exposed, those fault lines could swallow everything in their path before quietly sealing themselves again. By the time the decade ended, the massacre had been reduced to something so diffuse that even those who had lived through it struggled to explain it coherently. They could describe moments, expressions, changes in behavior, but not a single narrative thread that held everything together. That fragmentation was not accidental. It was the natural outcome of a conflict that had been resolved through subtraction rather than confrontation. Each death removed not only a person, but a version of events, a memory that could challenge the fragile consensus that formed afterward. What remained was a narrow corridor of acceptable explanation, one that avoided blame and discouraged curiosity. The city itself helped enforce that corridor. Chicago's scale allowed violence on its margins to dissolve into statistics, and when no one insisted on connecting the dots, there was no institutional reason to do so. The men who survived learned how to live with that reality, carrying a private accounting of what had happened while presenting a neutral face to the world. Some justified their silence as self-preservation. Others told themselves it honored the dead by preventing further loss. In truth, it was both, and neither explanation brought peace. Families of the victims continued to mark time through absence, birthdays without calls, holidays with empty chairs, a quiet awareness that their questions would never be answered fully. Attempts to revisit the events years later met the same resistance, not from an organized cover-up, but from the cumulative weight of fatigue and fear. Too much had been lost to risk destabilizing what little stability remained. The stolen tractor lingered as an almost absurd symbol of that loss, its fate unknown, its importance impossible to justify against the scale of what followed. And yet, it was precisely that absurdity that explained why the story faded. People resist narratives that suggest lives can be erased over something so small. It is easier to believe there were larger forces at work, hidden motives that would make the outcome feel proportionate. The reality was more unsettling. The massacre unfolded not because of grand ambition or ideology, but because of hesitation, mistrust, and the slow escalation of fear. Once that fear took hold, Every attempt to contain it only fed it further. When the violence finally stopped, it did so not with resolution, but with exhaustion, leaving behind a city that had absorbed 14 deaths without ever acknowledging them as a single event. That absorption is what made the massacre forgotten, not a deliberate erasure, but a collective decision, but repeated over years, to let silence stand where explanation would only reopen wounds that could never be closed cleanly. In the end, what survived of the massacre was not a story, but a constraint, an invisible boundary that shaped behavior without ever being named. The men who remained learned to recognize how quickly informal systems could turn inward when trust broke down, and that recognition altered how problems were handled long after the last death. Disputes were addressed earlier. Agreements were clarified instead of assumed. Silence, once treated as neutrality, was understood as something dangerous if left unchallenged. Those changes did not come from policy or law enforcement reform. They came from memory, carried quietly by people who knew what had happened and what it had cost. Over time, that memory thinned, but its influence did not. New generations inherited the caution without inheriting the details, sensing only that certain lines were not crossed and certain questions were not asked. The massacre of 1985 remained forgotten because it no longer needed to be remembered to serve its function. It had already reshaped the environment that produced it. The stolen tractor, never recovered and never officially accounted for, faded into obscurity, its role in the violence almost impossible to reconcile with the scale of the outcome. And yet, that imbalance was the point. It exposed how fragile the structures were that held people together on the margins of a city, and how quickly they could collapse when hesitation replaced resolution. 14 men died, not because the tractor mattered, but because the uncertainty surrounding it was allowed to spread unchecked, turning suspicion into obligation and obligation into elimination. When the violence stopped, it left behind a city that closed over the wound without healing it, choosing continuity over confrontation. That choice ensured survival, but it also ensured forgetting. There would be no final reckoning, no official acknowledgement, no clear lesson drawn in public. The massacre would exist only as an absence, felt but not discussed, shaping decisions quietly from the edges of memory. And that is why it remains what it is today, a forgotten chapter in Chicago's history, not erased but absorbed. Its silence standing as the final consequence of a theft that should have ended with a returned machine, and instead ended with 14 lives quietly disappearing into the city's background noise. As time passed, even the silence surrounding the massacre became normalized, folded into the city's wider habit of looking forward rather than back. Chicago rebuilt itself repeatedly in the decades that followed. Neighborhoods changed. Industries collapsed and reformed. People moved in and out, carrying no awareness of what had once unfolded in the shadows of loading yards and side streets. The places where key conversations happened were repurposed or torn down. The routes men once took to avoid, being seen blended back into ordinary traffic. Nothing marked them as significant anymore. And yet, for those who had been close enough to feel the pressure when it was happening, the memory never disappeared completely. It lived in reflexes rather than recollections, in the instinct to resolve problems before they hardened, in the discomfort that surfaced when something small went unresolved for too long. The massacre left behind no clear moral, no lesson that could be packaged or taught. It offered only a warning implicit in its shape, that systems built on trust without structure are fragile, and when they fail inward, consuming everyone connected to them. The stolen tractor was never meant to matter beyond the moment it went missing. Its power came entirely from what followed, from the hesitation, the avoidance, the refusal to confront a problem while it was still manageable. By the time that refusal gave way to action, it was already too late to act cleanly. 14 men died not because anyone wanted a massacre, but because each step toward stopping it was delayed, until stopping it meant erasing the problem entirely. That is what ultimately doomed the story to obscurity. There was no single villain to condemn, no clear injustice to rally against. Only a sequence of choices that made sense in isolation and proved catastrophic in combination. Remembering it in full would require confronting that reality, and confronting it would offer no comfort. So the city moved on, carrying the weight quietly, allowing the massacre to dissolve into the background of its history. The forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 remains exactly that, not because it lacked consequence, but because its consequences were absorbed so completely that nothing was left to point at except the absence of 14 men and a question no one ever answered. How something so small was allowed to grow until silence became the only way it could end. What finally sealed the story's disappearance was not a decision made in a courtroom or a newsroom, but 1,000 small choices made afterward, each one favoring continuity over confrontation. People chose not to ask certain questions at work. Families chose not to compare timelines too closely. Investigators chose not to push cases that refused to produce evidence. Each choice made sense on its own. Together, they ensured the massacre would never reassemble itself into something recognizable. The 14 men who died over a stolen tractor were absorbed into the city's broader pattern of loss, their deaths indistinguishable from countless others once the connective tissue between them was gone. And that loss of connection was decisive. Without a narrative to hold them together, the deaths became isolated facts rather than a single event. Easier to forget, easier to live around. Years later, when occasional references surfaced in passing conversations or half-remembered rumors, they sounded exaggerated, implausible, almost insulting in their simplicity. A tractor, 14 men. The scale felt wrong, and that wrongness encouraged dismissal. People prefer explanations that feel proportional. This one never did. So it remained unspoken, preserved only in behavior and caution, in the quiet understanding that unresolved problems could metastasize if left alone. The massacre's true legacy was not fear, but attentiveness, a hard-earned instinct to intervene early, to clarify intentions, to prevent silence from becoming dangerous again. That instinct endured even as the details faded, shaping choices long after the original actors were gone. And in that way, the forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 reached its final form. Not as a story told and retold, but as a boundary, invisible yet firm, marking the point where hesitation once proved fatal. The tractor was never found. The men were never avenged. There was no justice that could be measured or closure that could be claimed. What remained was a city that closed over the wound and kept moving, carrying the weight quietly, ensuring that what happened once would not need to happen again. That silence, heavy and deliberate, is why the massacre is remembered only by its absence, and why something so small could leave a mark so large without ever demanding to be named. In the end, the massacre left behind nothing tangible to investigate, and no clear moment to remember. Only a pattern of behavior that spoke louder than any record ever could. 14 men died, not in a burst of chaos, but through a slow, methodical narrowing of options that made survival feel conditional and silence feel necessary. The stolen tractor, never recovered and never properly accounted for, remained a hollow center around which everything else collapsed. its absence standing in for all the decisions that were postponed until they became irreversible. Chicago absorbed the loss the way it absorbs so many things, by allowing it to disperse into background noise, into separate incidents that never quite added up to a single story. That dispersal was what ensured forgetting. Without a narrative to anchor it, the massacre dissolved into routine, into the city's long history of things that happened without explanation and then moved on. What endured was not fear, but a quiet recalibration of how people on the margins handled uncertainty. An understanding that unresolved questions carried weight, and that waiting too long to address them could be deadly. The men who lived through it carried that understanding forward, shaping their choices in ways that never drew attention and never needed to be explained. And so the forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 remains exactly that. A chapter closed without being written. A sequence of deaths tied together only by what was never said. It did not leave behind justice or closure. Only an absence that settled into the city and stayed there, unnoticed by most, but powerful enough to change how things were done. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and when it was over, the city chose not to remember the details. Only the cost of letting something small grow unchecked until silence was the only ending left. What makes the story so difficult to hold on to, even now, is that nothing about it fits the shape people expect. There was no mastermind, no single moment where everything snapped into focus, no ending that offered relief. The massacre unfolded because no one wanted to be the first to force clarity. And once clarity became unavoidable, it arrived in its most destructive form. 14 men died, not because anyone set out to create a massacre, but because each decision was delayed until delay itself became lethal. The stolen tractor was only the spark. What burned was trust, restraint, and the belief that problems could be left alone without consequence. When the violence stopped, it left behind a city that continued on unchanged to anyone who hadn't been close enough to feel it. Streets stayed busy. Jobs were filled. Life moved forward. But underneath that movement sat an understanding shared by a shrinking number of people. That something small had once been allowed to grow until it consumed everyone tied to it. That understanding required no retelling. It didn't need to be passed down as a story. It lived in caution, in the instinct to resolve disputes early, in the refusal to let silence stretch too long without challenge. The massacre was forgotten because forgetting made survival possible. Remembering it in detail would have required confronting how fragile the balance really was, and how easily it could collapse again. So the city chose absorption over acknowledgement, letting the events of 1985 sink into its foundation without ever rising back to the surface. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and when it was over, there was no justice to point to and no lesson announced aloud. There was only the quiet agreement, formed afterward and held ever since, that some truths are too costly to exhume, and that the price of letting something small go unresolved can be far greater than anyone expects. What remains, decades later, is not outrage or mystery, but a kind of quiet caution that never fully disappears. The forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 does not live in archives or court records, because it was never allowed to take that form. It exists in what people chose not to pursue, not to challenge, not to connect once the cost of doing so became clear. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and the city absorbed that outcome without ever naming it as a single event. That absorption was the final act, the mechanism that ensured it would not be revisited, argued over, or resolved in any traditional sense. There was no justice, because justice would have required reopening a sequence of decisions that no one believed could be untangled without causing further harm. There was no closure because closure would have implied an ending that never truly arrived. Instead, the massacre dissolved into the background of a city accustomed to carrying loss quietly, allowing it to become part of the environment rather than an interruption to it. The tractor itself, whether destroyed, sold, or forgotten, no longer mattered. Its role was complete the moment the violence it triggered could no longer be stopped. What mattered was the lesson embedded in the silence that followed. That hesitation can be as dangerous as action. That unresolved conflict does not fade on its own. And that once fear replaces trust, the cost of restoring balance can be devastating. The story endures not because it is told, but because it shaped how people behaved afterward, enforcing limits that were never written down. And that is why it remains forgotten. Not because it lacked consequence, but because remembering it fully would require confronting how easily something ordinary can spiral into something irreversible when no one is willing to stop it in time. There is no final document to point to, no last interview that ties the story together, no recovered object that restores order to the narrative. The forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 ends the way it unfolded. Without ceremony, without resolution, and without a record that feels complete. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor. Not because the tractor mattered, but because the uncertainty surrounding it was allowed to spread until it became more dangerous than any direct accusation ever could. Each delay hardened suspicion. Each attempt to avoid confrontation made confrontation inevitable. When the violence stopped, it did so not with relief, but with exhaustion, leaving behind a city that closed ranks around the absence and moved forward as if nothing singular had happened. That decision ensured survival, but it also ensured silence. Over time, the silence became normal, and the massacre slipped fully out of view, remembered only by the way problems were handled afterward and by the instinct to never let something small remain unresolved for too long. This is why the story resists being told cleanly. It offers no comfort, no clear villain, no proportional explanation. It only shows how easily ordinary situations can collapse into irreversible outcomes when fear and hesitation replace clarity. The tractor was never found. The men were never officially connected. The case was never acknowledged as a case. What remains is an absence that still shapes behavior decades later, a reminder that forgetting is sometimes not a failure of memory, but a strategy for living with what cannot be undone. Nothing more ever surfaced after that. No new witnesses, no recovered evidence, no late confession that rewrote the story. The massacre stayed sealed not by force, but by time, by the slow erosion of context that makes even the most severe events feel distant and unreal. 14 men died in Chicago in 1985, and the reason was so small it became easier to doubt than to confront. A stolen tractor, a missing explanation, a series of choices made too late. As years passed, the people who might have spoken lost the words, or the need, or the courage. Those who came after inherited only the outcomes, not the causes, and without causes, the story had no shape. That is why it never became a warning taught or a case studied. It became something quieter and more dangerous. A buried example of how quickly order can collapse when no one is willing to act early, and how easily a city can absorb loss when it arrives one man at a time. The forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 remains exactly where it ended. Suspended in silence, its details dissolved, its impact invisible but enduring. 14 lives were erased over one stolen tractor, And when it was over, there was no reckoning, only continuation. And in that continuation, the city ensured the story would never demand to be remembered, even as it continued to shape what people were careful never to let happen again. What ultimately defines the forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 is not the violence itself, but the way it vanished without resistance. In most crimes of that scale, something remains. A trial, a name, a photograph, a fixed moment people can point to and say, "This is where it happened." Here, there was nothing like that. The deaths were spaced out just enough, explained away just convincingly enough, and ignored just thoroughly enough that no single authority ever felt compelled to connect them. By the time anyone might have realized that 14 men had been lost to the same unresolved conflict, there was no path backward that didn't threaten to expose far more than it would resolve. That reality shaped the response more than fear ever did. Silence became practical. Forgetting became functional. The stolen tractor, absurd in its simplicity, became untouchable as a subject precisely because acknowledging its role would have forced a reckoning with how disproportionate the outcome had been. It was easier to let the story collapse under its own weight than to carry it forward intact. And so it faded, not dramatically, but efficiently, leaving behind no scars visible to the outside world. The massacre did not end with justice or acknowledgement. It ended with adaptation. People learned what the city would tolerate, what it would absorb, and what it would quietly erase. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and the city proved that if loss arrives slowly enough, even something that severe can disappear without leaving a mark that demands to be traced. By the time anyone could have told the story cleanly, there was no longer a reason to. The people who would have benefited from speaking were gone, and the people who remained had learned exactly what speaking cost. The massacre did not leave behind heroes or villains, only participants and witnesses who understood that survival depended on restraint, not truth. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and that fact alone was enough to make the story uncomfortable, even implausible, to those who heard it secondhand. Implausibility became its shield. A narrative that sounds wrong is easy to dismiss, and dismissal is all a forgotten event needs to stay buried. Chicago carried on, absorbing the losses into its larger rhythm, allowing them to blend into a decade already defined by violence and transition. What separated this from everything else was not the number of dead, but the absence of resolution. No charges, no trials, no moment where the city was forced to look at itself and ask how something so minor had spiraled so far. That question was never asked publicly, and because it wasn't asked, it never demanded an answer. The stolen tractor was reduced to a footnote that no one wrote down, its role preserved only in the behavior of those who learned from the outcome. They learned that hesitation compounds risk, that silence can become lethal, and that informal systems collapse fastest when everyone waits for someone else to act first. Those lessons outlived the people who paid for them. The forgotten Chicago massacre of 1985 did not end in justice or understanding. It ended in normalization, the quiet acceptance that what had happened would not be revisited, because revisiting it would change nothing except reopen wounds that time had sealed. 14 men disappeared into the city's background, and the tractor that started it all disappeared with them, leaving behind a single enduring truth that no one ever stated aloud. When something small goes unresolved for too long, the cost of fixing it can become far greater than anyone is willing to pay. And that truth, unstated but understood, is why the story finally stops where it does. There is no aftermath to investigate, no hidden document waiting to surface. No final revelation that reframes what happened. The Forgotten Chicago Massacre of 1985 ends not with discovery, but with acceptance. Acceptance that 14 men died because a problem was allowed to remain unresolved until resolution itself became impossible. Acceptance that the scale of the outcome no longer matched the scale of the cause, and that trying to reconcile the two would only expose how fragile the balance had been all along. The city moved forward, and in doing so, it sealed the story beneath layers of routine, distraction, and time. New crises demanded attention. New losses replaced old ones. The massacre faded not because it lacked importance, but because importance alone was not enough to keep it visible. What remains is a caution that survives without being named, carried quietly in how conflicts are handled and how silence is treated. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and when it was over, there was no reckoning to mark the end. Only a return to normalcy that absorbed the cost without acknowledging it. That absorption is the final act of the story. The reason it cannot be cleanly told, and the reason it persists only as absence. The massacre did not disappear because it was erased. It disappeared because everyone who lived through it learned that remembering it openly would change nothing, and forgetting it was the only way the city could continue to function without tearing itself apart again. By the time the story finally runs out of momentum, what's left is not mystery, but inevitability. Everything that could be said has already been avoided. Every question that might have mattered was deferred until it no longer could. The Forgotten Chicago Massacre of 1985 does not invite investigation because it offers no leverage point, no moment where a different decision would clearly have changed the outcome. The theft of the tractor was small. The delay in addressing it was ordinary. The escalation was gradual enough to feel survivable at every stage, right up until it wasn't. That is why the story resists being framed as a warning or a lesson. It does not point to a single mistake, only to a pattern of restraint that turned destructive once it accumulated. 14 men were killed over one stolen tractor, and the city absorbed that loss without naming it, without pausing long enough for it to become something fixed in memory. When people later tried to reconstruct what had happened, they found only gaps where certainty should have been, and those gaps discouraged further effort. A story without anchors does not spread. It fades, and so this one did, leaving behind only an understanding shared by those who lived close enough to feel it. That unresolved problems do not disappear, they change form. And when they do, they often demand a price far greater than anyone anticipates. The massacre ends not with answers, but with the quiet recognition that nothing more can be recovered, and that what was lost will remain lost, folded permanently into the city's past, unmarked and unnamed.